The book of Acts is my focus this morning, and I like this topic because I've done so much focusing on the Gospels that sometimes it's easy to forget that the book of Acts is of evidential interest in its own right. I'll start today with an epigraph from the words of Jesus, one of my favorite sayings of Jesus in Matthew 13, and that is this one. Jesus says to his disciples, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Today I have things that are new to tell you, but I also have things that are old to tell you, and I hope by the time we're done you understand why I would choose that for my motto." It's a good idea to set up a talk like this with a foil, with someone against whom you are reacting, and in this case, who better than Bart Ehrman? From his blog, where he did a mock debate regarding the historical value of Acts, on the negative side, in person as the negative proponent, he said, "As valuable as Acts may be, as an interesting story about the first years and decades of the early Christian movement, the reality is that the book of Acts is not historically reliable." Now, the arguments that Bart used in his little mock debate are actually arguments that he's made in his own voice elsewhere in his writings when he's not putting on a persona. So I feel no compunction about taking him at his word that this is what he really believes. Shocker, I disagree. Actually, Bart should be miffed with me right now because last night at the Atheist Christian Book Club, they had a discussion of his book, Jesus Interrupted. And they like to invite the authors to Skype in, take a few questions, and they sent the invitation out to Bart Ehrman and got a little form letter back from him saying, "Unfortunately, I am going to be unable to attend your meeting." So they invited me instead. And my goal was to make Bart sorry he said no to them. So we'll continue that theme of pursuing Bart while we're down here. In many ways, Acts is the keystone in the arch of the New Testament. It bridges the gap between the Gospels and Paul's letters. The Gospels end with the death and resurrection of Jesus. The letters of Paul show him interacting with the Christian movement already on the ground, flourishing, growing. And the book of Acts tells you how we got from the resurrection to these churches in all these places that Paul is visiting, some of them founding, some of them writing to because he's never been there. It's authenticated in multiple ways. There are points of external confirmation. I'm going to go through these really fast. So again, for those of you who take notes, God bless you, this is going to be like drinking out of a fire hose. I am giving all of my slides from all of my presentations to Travis Dickinson. You can just ask him, and he will give them to you. So there are going to be a whole bunch of things flickering across the screen with references that you're not going to be able to write down unless you have a system of shorthand that is better than anything I've ever seen. Don't worry about that. You can get all the references and go check up everything I've said afterward. It's also confirmed by undesigned coincidences, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that kind of argument, I'll show you some examples and give you some places where you can go. And it's confirmed by internal evidence of authenticity of other kinds, which I'll just touch on if we get time before 12:30 hits. So it provides a very natural way to authenticate the Gospels because, after all, Acts is Luke part 2. It's written by the same person. Virtually every scholar everywhere acknowledges that it's written by this same individual. And so if we see that this individual was highly historically reliable in writing the book of Acts, that will reflect on what we can expect in the Gospel of Luke. Here are some points of external confirmation. If you look at the book of Acts, we'll just start halfway through. Begin with chapter 13 and the missionary journeys of Paul. As Paul begins to travel round the rim of the Mediterranean Sea, the book of Acts intersects what we know about the Greco-Roman world in numerous ways. So what follows is a very brief, very incomplete sample of the points where the historical accuracy of Acts is confirmed by sources outside of the Bible. I'm going to do a few dozen of these. There are more than 100 of these points of confirmation. And when I say this, I want you to understand we're talking about a world without Wikipedia. You couldn't look this stuff up as background research for your novel. This is not the kind of information you could pull out of the public libraries. You can't find these points of confirmation. You can't find these historical details in Josephus. Some people try to say, oh, yeah, the book of Acts is a ripoff of stuff in Josephus. Really? Knock yourself out. Find these. So here we go. Overland routes, cities, landmarks, political boundaries. Well, that's no problem, right? Google Earth. By the way, Alan Hainline, who's here today, how many of you have used Google Earth? You're using Alan's software code. He's kind of a bright guy. He really is a rocket scientist, too. I mean, the guy's just beyond. But look at all these points. The proper location of Iconium. It's in Phrygia rather than in Lycaonia. That's a difficult call to make, even archaeologically. Looking at it, we've had to do some work to figure out what that is. But in Acts chapter 14, that's just nailed. The correct order of approach from the Cilician gates, you're going to come to Derbe, then you're going to come to Lystra. How do you figure that out in a world where you can't just pull out an almanac and look it up in a map? The proper description of Philippi as a Roman colony and the identification of its seaport, Neapolis. This is attested in manuscripts and in the evidence of coins, what we call the numismatic evidence. The right location of a small river near Philippi. If you're not there, how do you find that out? Well, maybe he got lucky and he talked to somebody who had a vacation there once. Really, for all of these points, let's keep going. The proper locations, Amphipolis, Apollonia, they're cities about 30 miles apart where travelers would spend successive nights on this journey to Thessalonica. You need to time out your travel. 30 miles a day is pretty much going to max out what normal, healthy human beings are going to be able to make in a day. So the spacing is right. Sea routes and landmarks. There's a natural crossing between two correctly named ports. Mount Casius in the south of Seleucia is within sight of Cyprus, so he's got these little details about natural routes by sea. There's a port at Perga for a ship that would be crossing from Cyprus. That's in there. The proper port that returning travelers would use would be Italia. This is a coasting port. This isn't for like going out across the open sea. This is for moving up the coast from one coastal place to another. That's where they would intercept a coasting vessels. By contrast with Perga, Perga's a river port for coming down a river. The place of a conspicuous sailor's landmark with a 5,000-foot mountain. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens from Berea, because the Etesian winds of the summer would take you right down that way. Local customs and beliefs. The depiction of philosophical debate in the Agora, that was characteristic of Athenian life. We've got this from many non-Christian sources. The proper reaction of Greek philosophers. They're listening to Paul until he comes to bodily resurrection. At that point, all right, enough. Now, if you look at the words of Aeschylus in the Eumenides, you find that this is encoded in Greek literature. Once a mortal's blood has drained into the dust, the man is dead, and then there's no return. The fact that the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city. We have inscriptions from the year 104 that confirm that this was the public meeting place of the city. Local languages, dialects, terminology. The name Lystra is really quite unusual, but it's correct. The Lycaonian language, it was quite unusual for towns in Asia Minor like that, regions in Asia Minor, to have their own distinct language and not use the common Greek, the Koine Greek. But they did there. And it's there that we find this picked up on in Luke's account in Acts 14. The form of the name Troas, it undergoes changes in its form. If you're writing about it at the wrong time, you get it wrong. Luke gets it right. The correct use of Athenian slang. Paul is called a spermologos, a seed picker, and the proper name for the court where he speaks, the hill of Ares, the Areopagus. The expression, the great goddess Artemis, from inscriptions at Ephesus, we have that full expression confirmed. That's awesome. So, yeah, wow. All right. Who was it who was joking I was going to work a miracle in this room at some point? Can you all hear me if I just talk like this? Is it good? All right. I'm just going to keep on going, and when the power gets fully back up and we're up and running, we are. More stuff that the book of Acts gets right. There's a term for the goddess, Hetheos. It's a bit of an unusual term, but that is the proper designation for the goddess Artemis. There's a document called the Salutaris document where we find this all over the place, this Ephesian term for their goddess. Is that one going to work? No.
Hello.
All right. We'll just rock and roll with this. There's a precise ethnic designation for a Berean, and this terminology is attested in local inscriptions, but you can't find it in other writings. Nobody can go and read through Josephus and find this specific designation for Bereans. There's a specific ethnic term meaning a Greek living in Asia, Asianos. The Greeks honor a Sardian citizen with this designation in an inscription that we've got, and I've got the reference here for you. Local religious practices. Do you remember what happens when Paul and Barnabas come to Lystra? Who do they get mistaken for? Zeus and Hermes. We've got epigraphic evidence from Lystra itself that those were the local deities at that time. How do you do background research on this if you're writing a novel?
Yeah.
That's problematic. But if you're really there, no problem. The abundant presence of images in Athens. We have this attested by many Greek writers. Local religious practices. There's an altar to an unknown god. But Diogenes Laertius and Pausanias tell us that there were such altars, and they even tell us a story about how they came to be in Athens. That's what Paul picks up on when he's at Mars Hill. I see you're a very religious people. I even noticed an altar to the unknown God. Let me tell you about him. What a beautiful hook. What a brilliant example of getting into the context and picking up on something. That is just wonderful. Notice also Paul's references to temples that are made with hands in Acts 17. Where is he speaking? It's a location dominated by the Parthenon. It's surrounded by other shrines of the finest classical art. The images of Artemis, Acts 19, terracotta images of Artemis abound in the archaeological evidence. The locations of Jewish synagogues in Thessalonica, in Athens, in Corinth. Titles of local officials. This is a nice one because you just can't do this. You can't do this by the seat of your pants. What would the local officials be called in the colony at Philippi? They'd be, well, I don't know, they'd be the mayor or something. No, they're strategoi. They are magistrates. There's a more general term in Acts 16:19, but then in verse 22 we get the specific one. But you know what? If you tried to use that term in Thessalonica, you'd be using the wrong term. There, it's the politarchs, the politarchoi. But if you tried to use that term for the people who are in charge in Athens, nope, when Paul's at Mars Hill, it's Areopagites. Now that's the right term. But if you're in Corinth and you're wondering who's the guy in charge when Paul is brought in, he's not a strategoi. He's not one of the politarchi. He's not an Areopagite. He's a proconsul. He's resident in Corinth. By the way, we know this from Tacitus and others, that he was in Corinth from the summer of 51 to the spring of 52, and that was it. So since Paul encounters him there, that's one of the chronological points that lets us nail down Paul's itinerary. Titles of local officials in Ephesus. It would be the chief executive magistrate in Ephesus, the grammatus, still a different title. Who would the temple keeper be? Well, that's the neokoros. That's the commonly authorized term by the Romans for major cities that have an official temple of the imperial cult. The proper term for the assizes, holding court under the proconsul, Acts 19. Here's a really lovely one. Do you remember what happens in Acts 22? The Roman tribune orders Paul to be flogged, and that plan is interrupted when Paul asks, is it permissible to flog a Roman citizen uncondemned? And the guys who were getting ready to flog him say, we're out of here, not doing this, because you can be crucified for flogging a Roman citizen uncondemned. And so in comes the tribune, and he says, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? This is Acts chapter 22. And he said, yes. The tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. And Paul said, but I'm a citizen by birth. Now, what's the story behind that? The Emperor Claudius had begun selling Roman citizenship to raise money. And at first, he made the price really high, and so people had to expend their life savings to achieve the status of citizen of Rome. Then after he'd soaked the rich, he still wanted more money, so he dropped the price a little bit. And then he dropped it some more, and then he dropped it some more, and then he dropped it some more. And the people who had basically mortgaged everything they had to get that citizenship at top dollar were more than a little bit peeved about the fact that they could have just waited around and picked it up cheap. And that's the backstory that gives color and full body and dimensionality to this story of Paul and the tribune. And the tribune's like, well, I had to pay a lot of money for that. How much did you pay for it? Paul says, I was born free. A little bit of background that makes the story come alive. And then there are numerous other points of external evidence involving local industries, proper nautical terminology. The voyage and shipwreck of Paul is a talk all by itself. And in fact, I have an old book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. So if you want that, ask me and you shall receive. It's a wonderful book by Smith of Jordan Hill. He was a yachtsman. He actually went and wintered at Malta. He sailed over the entire route of Paul's journeys. And he said, the last chapters of Acts were written by an eyewitness, and he was not a sailor. Got to read it. It's beautiful. A Roman historian's judgment, A.N. Sherwin-White, in his book Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, sums it up this way. For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. That's a quick survey of some of the external evidence. There's about 3 times that much more that you can get. And I'll tell you where to get it when we hit the end here. But now I want to shift gears. We've been talking about comparing the book of Acts to what we know from totally outside of the Christian writings. Now I'd like to do something else. I'd like to talk about undesigned coincidences. How many of you have heard a talk on this or seen me do it somewhere, and the rest of you are just sitting there going, uh-oh, new terminology, what do we do? Okay, fast intro to it, and then it's best picked up by examples. So I'm going to do this with examples, and I think you'll see right away where I'm going with this. Undesigned coincidences are cases where 2 different texts interlock with one another in a way that points to truth. Often this is because one of the texts raises some natural question which the other provides, perhaps even in passing, the explanation or the answer to. Such interlocking is not very likely if one of them were copied from the other, or if both of them were copied from a common source, or if the later book just added a bunch of legends to the former. We know what that looks like. We've got Gnostic so-called Gospels from the 2nd century adding a bunch of legends about Jesus. They don't interlock with one another like that. They don't intersect one another like that. Fictions and forgeries either don't interlock at all, or they interlock in more obvious ways because they're intended to be noticed. Fictions, how many of you pick up a copy of The Fellowship of the Ring to answer the questions you had left over when you finished Moby Dick? No? Why not? Why wouldn't you do that? Because the books are not anchored in the same independent historical reality. They're not anchored in the same set of events and facts. So of course we don't expect them to explain one another. But we would expect to find interlockings like this in authentic records of the same real event told by different people who knew what they were talking about and were trying to be truthful. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that it's such a beautiful thing that we have 4 Gospels. Sometimes we want to complain about this. Oh, the synoptic problem. How do I work out the literary relationships of these Gospels? Why aren't they all on the same page here? Oh, there's this unique material. What do I do with this? And the beautiful thing about undesigned coincidences is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you think Markan priority is the right view, the Gospel of Mark was the first one written, or Matthean priority, or Lindsay and Bivens' theory of Lucan priority. It just doesn't matter because every one of the Gospels has material that explains things in the others, and every one of the Gospels has things that are explained by materials in the others. The connections go every which way. They're not just all going one direction. It's not Mark explaining everything else, or everybody else explaining Mark, because every which way. But we have these between the letters of Paul and the book of Acts too. Let me give you a quick one. I'm going to use one of the pastoral epistles, 2 Timothy, which some people doubt was Paul's work. I'm not impressed with their arguments, but I want to use it to show you the type of thing that I have in mind. 2 Timothy 3:15, Paul, writing to Timothy, says, "From childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus." Now, here's the puzzle. Timothy is a Greek name. I should know. How did he come to be instructed in the Jewish scriptures, which is what this must refer to, if he's got a Greek name? Well, let's read in Acts 16, very beginning of the chapter. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. Okay, mama does the religious education, daddy gives the boy a Greek name. Makes sense. Also, what else do we know about Paul and Timothy? What does Timothy do before he takes, what does Paul do with Timothy before he takes him with him on his journeys? He circumcises him. So this tells us something else. Daddy said, you can give the boy a religious education, but I'm drawing the line there. So here he is. He's a young man, and Paul has to circumcise him to take him on so that he won't be an offense to the Jewish places where they're stopping and ministering. What a fascinating little insight into that. Let's see a few more of these interlockings between Paul's letters. And now I'm going to stick to letters of Paul that are acknowledged even by somebody like Bart Ehrman to be authentic letters of Paul. Philippians 2:22, he's writing to this church at Philippi. He says, "You know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel." Okay, we read that. That's a nice sentiment. But here's the puzzle. When we read that Paul picks up Timothy and takes him with him in Acts 16, it mentions that he's with Paul at the very beginning, Iconium and Lystra. But then there's no further mention of Timothy As Paul travels across Asia, he goes through Asia Minor to Troas, he sails to Macedonia, he passes through Philippi, no mention of Timothy. He comes to Thessalonica, a riot arises, forces Paul to go with Silas, no mention of Timothy, to Berea, and then his agitators follow, and then Paul has to go on to Athens. Where's Timothy? And if he's not there, how do the Philippians know about Timothy? But then we keep going to Acts 17, verse 14. Paul's got to go down to Athens, but Silas and Timothy remained there in Berea. Just dropped in incidentally. So for all this time, it looks like maybe Timothy had left the party, but actually he's just spent silently there all along, going all the way through Philippi and over, and now he remains there when Paul goes onward. Just a nice little touch. So Philippians connects with Acts. If you're writing notes, might want just find a blank place. Put Acts in the middle, put Philippians out here, and draw an arrow from Philippians to Acts. How about 1 Corinthians and Acts chapter 19? 1 Corinthians 4. We treat these passages like flyover territory as we're reading. You don't hear expository preaching about them because they're not beautiful things like those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. They're mundane little details, but they're beautiful because details reveal what's really going on. It's very hard to forge details. How many of you have tried to read the so-called Gospel of Thomas? Thrilling stuff, isn't it? Jesus said this. Jesus said that. Peter asked. Jesus said this. Jesus said. Jesus said. Jesus said. You're like, is there a story here? Well, no, actually, there's not. In fact, you have to go halfway through the Gospel of Thomas before you get any reference to any geographical place at all. And then it says, a Samaritan was carrying a lamb to Judea. That's kind of like saying Texas exists. Not exactly detailed, intimate knowledge. But watch this one. 1 Corinthians 4:17, Paul says to them, that is why I sent you Timothy. Implication, Timothy's gone to them. And yet, when you get to 1 Corinthians 16, verse 10, Paul says, when Timothy comes, receive him this way. Now think about this. Let's work out the timeline. Paul sends Timothy to Corinth. Then he sits down and writes a letter in which he says, that's why I sent Timothy to you. But he expects that when they get the letter, Timothy won't be there yet, and he wants to instruct them about what to do when Timothy does get there. Was Timothy just slow? What's going on here? Now, the beautiful thing is when you go to Acts chapter 19, you see this whole thing from a different perspective, not from the inside, but from the outside. Now, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now, without a map, we'll have to do this way. Paul's over here in Ephesus. I'll actually put this off the screen, okay? Whoop, wow, I'm hitting a bunch of buttons at once. This is spectacular. Wow, sorry about that. There is more information there that we're going to be getting to. So, try it again. He's over here. Corinth is over there. And he's sending Timothy up into Macedonia to come overland, visiting churches, Paul knows, and then to come down to Corinth this way. Meanwhile, how's the letter going? Straight across the Aegean Sea. And so geographically, it makes sense. You send a letter, you're not going to send the letter by the overland route, but if you're sending people to go and visit churches you've been in, they can't do that on the boat. They've got to go up and hit these places one by one. So that actually makes sense of Paul's curious language in 1 Corinthians 4 and 1 Corinthians 16. So if you're drawing the arrows, here's the one now from 1 Corinthians to Acts. Let's do Galatians. Chapter 1, verse 17, and Acts 9, 3 through 8. Acts 9 says explicitly Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, and then he goes into Damascus, and they come and lay hands on him, and he receives his sight back. In telling his story in his own words, he doesn't say directly where that conversion took place. But if you keep on reading, he just remarks in passing that after escaping the plot against his life and going into Arabia, he returned again to Damascus. So he indirectly confirms what Acts tells us very explicitly. There's just a little point, again, of connection between Paul's letters and the book of Acts. How about 2 Corinthians? Here's a fun one. In Acts 18, we learn that Paul began his ministry in Corinth working as a tent maker, and he takes up lodging with Aquila and Priscilla. They do that too. And it says that he does this 6 days a week, and then on the Sabbath, he goes into the synagogues. But then, curiously enough, we read when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. Now, I've got a question for you. Does Paul strike you as the kind of guy to do anything by half measures? Not even a little bit. So, why was he only preaching 1 day a week until Silas and Timothy came, and then suddenly he's full on? A little bit weird. Go over to 1 Corinthians 11. When I was with you and was in need, he says, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. Indeed, he tells them, I robbed other churches to serve you. Paul's got something going with the church at Corinth. Somebody there is accusing him of being in it for the money, I think. Because he's very insistent on this point. I wouldn't take a penny from you. I let other churches support me when I minister to you. I would rather die than be deprived of this boast. I preach the gospel of Jesus Christ free of charge. Something's going on there that he's really insistent on, and it just happens to interlock with this curious bit in Acts 18, and to explain why Paul might have been working with his hands all days a week but one, and then suddenly shift over to full-time ministry. Those of you who are thinking of going into full-time ministry will appreciate this vividly when you're trying to raise support. So now 2 Corinthians intersects with Acts there. And it does so in another way. Right at the beginning, remember 2 Corinthians 3? Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? What's that all about? It seems that Paul has someone in mind who has come to Corinth bearing letters of recommendation. Who would that be? You won't find out by reading his letters to the church at Corinth. But if you go back to the end of Acts 18, you'll find when Apollos wished to cross to Achaia, Corinth is the main city in Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. Oh, it was Apollos coming with letters of recommendation. And then you go back and you think about the things Paul was hearing from the church there. Oh, I am of Apollos. I am of Paul. I'm of Christ. And Paul just says, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. But again, just a little intersection of that with the acknowledged epistles of Paul. So what we have here is now a second interconnection between 2 Corinthians and Acts. By the way, I can't say this strongly enough. This is a kind of evidence that really carries its full force when you see the cumulative weight of these things. Any one of them by itself, you could just shrug and say, yeah, well, maybe that's just a coincidence. But when you get lots of them, it begins to sound silly to object, well, maybe that's also just a coincidence. For Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians alone, just those first 4. There are over 40 of these interconnections with the book of Acts. I am giving you only a few snowflakes on the tip of the great iceberg of evidence that there is here. So, tolle lege, as Augustine says, take up and read. There is more, and I'll give you sources for that. But I want to shift gears here and talk about a few other ways that there are these intersections. Think about the argument of Romans, because Romans is an argument. What is that argument? Well, it's something we're going to need to understand what's going on in Acts 21. They said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs." That's the rumor out there about you, Paul. Well, what could have provoked that kind of rumor about Paul's teaching? Because he didn't teach that. And yet, it's a noticeable, recognizable distortion of something he did say. So think about this. What's the central argument of the first part of Romans? Jews and Gentiles are on the same footing before God. Neither of them can be justified by the works of the law for the simple reason that no one actually keeps it. A new means of justification was therefore required in which the distinctiveness of Jewish descent and ceremony was no longer of central importance. Abraham's own justification was prior to his circumcision and independent of it, and Jewish converts were to consider the law as dead and themselves as married to another. Assume that Paul actually preached what he wrote to the Romans, and the puzzle is resolved. The accusation, though in its particulars it's untrue, so he didn't tell the Jewish Christians not to circumcise their male children, he even circumcised Timothy, is exactly the kind of extrapolation that ardent Jews might make from what he actually said. So in this case, we've got a connection of the thematic argument of Romans to explain how a certain rumor about Paul could have gotten started. I'll put in one connection to Ephesians 6, just a fun one. In Acts 28, Paul speaks of himself as an ambassador in a chain. And it's curious because that's chain singular rather than chains plural, as you find in Acts 26. Acts 28 tells us when we came to Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. And actually, we know what that was like. The soldier sits here. There's a shackle around his wrist. The chain from that goes over to a shackle around your wrist, and the two of you don't go anywhere independently. You go the same places together. And in Acts 28, Paul says, "For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you." He's speaking in person. This is not a letter. He's speaking in person. "Since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain." You can see him raising his arm and showing them the chain that's shackling him to the soldier who's sitting by wondering what in the world these guys are talking about in Aramaic. Okay, I don't know if they were talking Aramaic or not, but it's really vivid right there. So there's this connection where Acts helps us to understand why the singular would be used in Ephesians. Still time. We managed to keep pressing on through all the technological fun. So now I'm going to give you something a little different. I want to talk about the suitability of a letter for its audience. Have you ever noticed how similar Romans and Galatians are in terms of the points that Paul is making? How he even brings up Abraham in the same connection, and yet there's such a difference between them. And it's not just that Galatians is a lot shorter. What's the difference? They make the same points, they make use of many of the same examples, but the two churches have a very different relationship to Paul. In Galatians, he's writing to a church that knew him well. How does he enforce his argument? "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you have so soon departed from what you were taught?" He puts the points on his personal authority. because they know him. But in Romans, writing to a church he had never visited, he enforces the same claims by argument, and that takes more space. So he has to write them out at length. Same things are on his mind, same problems that he sees in the church in Galatia. He anticipates the possibility of them arising in Rome. And so he wants to make the same points, but he has to do it in a different way. Folks, this is what real history looks like. Real people with the same concerns on their minds, but framing them in ways designed to hit their audiences. But it's better because we've got that right within Acts. Some people try to say the speeches in Acts are just inventions. Nobody really knows what anybody said to these guys. I want to offer you evidence to the contrary. We have 3 accounts of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. We have Acts 9, which is the account in the narrator's words. We have the account in Acts 22 where Paul makes his defense to an unfriendly mob just up the stairway from the temple area. And then in Acts 26, he makes his defense before Festus and Agrippa. So here's the question. Do these variations in the accounts fit these very different circumstances? Well, in Acts 9, here's a good seminary quiz for y'all. What material is there about Paul's conversion in Acts chapter 9 that doesn't appear in Paul's own telling of his conversion? Ooh, Bible quiz gets intense. Welcome to level 7.
The other people heard the voice?
Nope, that's not what it's about. How does Paul get his sight back? Ananias. And when Ananias puts his hands on Paul's eyes, what is the description? Oh, it's like scales are falling from his eyes. You know what? The only person who mentions that is Luke, who's the guy narrating the event at this point. Why would Luke be interested in the medical details? Dr. Luke, the beloved physician mentioned in Colossians. Go through the Gospel of Luke sometime and look at places where Luke is talking about the same healing that you find in Matthew or Mark. Mark will tell you Jesus healed a man with a withered hand. Luke will tell you it was his right hand. You will read that Jesus healed a leper. Luke tells you his whole body was full of leprosy. This wasn't just a little psoriasis on his wrist. This was his whole body. Peter's mother-in-law was sick with a fever. Luke will tell you it was a great fever. This guy wants to know the details, and probably while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, he went around and gathered them. Just a little thing, small things. You put enough small things into the scales, and they begin to weigh, they begin to get heavy. In the speech at the temple in Acts 22, Paul is very careful to appeal to Jews. Look at the ways that he appeals to the Jews. He speaks to them in Aramaic. He calls his listeners brothers and fathers. He explains that he himself was raised in Jerusalem. He says he was trained under Gamaliel. He speaks of the law of our ancestors. He's appealing to his identity with them. He says that he was as zealous for God as any of you are today. He describes Ananias as a devout observer of the law, highly respected by all the Jews living there. And he delays for as long as he possibly can, saying one word. What is it? Gentiles. And as soon as he says that, the riot breaks out again, and the Roman guards have to haul him all the way up the stairway to the Fortress Antonia. Now go to Acts 26, and look how Paul defends himself to the Roman procurator, or actually in this case now it's just a governor there, in the face of opposition from the Jews. Think about what we just went through, how he tried to identify with the Jews, explain his Jewishness and all the connections he had to that. And now go to Acts 26. Different context, different needs. He speaks with no fear of sudden interruption or an outbreak of violence. He's got time to develop more doctrine. His strategy from the beginning is to draw a sharp contrast between himself and the Jews. The Jews are his accusers and adversaries, verse 2. He calls the Christians in Damascus saints, verse 10. He says he tried to force them to blaspheme. The Jews didn't think he tried to force them to blaspheme. He says so. He doesn't mention Ananias at all. His references to his own mission to the Gentiles are obvious. They're not disguised. They're not delayed. Look it up, verses 17, 20, 23. No fear of talking about mission to the Gentiles. And he mentions that the voice on the road to Damascus spoke to him in Aramaic. Why doesn't he have to say that in Acts 22? Because he's leaning over the railing, speaking to a group of Jews in Aramaic. Of course, they would assume the voice spoke in Aramaic. What else would it speak? But to the Greek audience, he mentions that detail. This is historical gold. And people like Bart Ehrman, who have made themselves professionally incapable of seeing this as evidence, are to be pitied. You want more? Further reading. There's a small book by Jefferson White called Evidence in Paul's Journeys. He is not a scholar, but he's read a lot of the scholarly material, and he's put together a very nice compilation of pieces of evidence of this kind. So it's a fairly inexpensive book. You can pick up a copy. It's light reading, and it does a very nice job of putting together a lot of these kinds of things that I have been talking about here. So if you're going to start studying the topic, that would be a great place to go. Won't break your piggy bank. Jefferson White, Evidence and Paul's Journeys. But if you want more, my wife and I actually persuaded the publisher of this one to reissue it. It was out of print. Cullen Hemer, The Book of Acts in a Setting of Hellenistic History. This is a tour de force. Hemer was a British classicist. His research was published after his death in 1987, so he had written most of the book, had notes for the rest. It had to be finished by a friend. It's a gold mine. I cannot praise it highly enough. So if you want to get into this at a research level, go straight to Hemer. Ken?
How come he only did the last part of Acts? Was there a reason for that?
You know, I think he was interested in the things that are revealed once Acts begins moving, once Paul begins moving out onto this wider canvas, this wider surface area, because that's where you have the chance to test so many things about the Lycaonian dialect and about the Temple of Artemis and things. Now he's all over the place, and we can go to multiple places to check it. So it's when Paul really hits the road that the confirmations start rolling in. He's outside the narrower orbit of Palestine. William Paley, Horai Paulini. Look, old books are good, people. Read old books. William Paley's book is not written in Latin, despite the title. That just means the times of Paul. It's a detailed comparison of the Pauline epistles with the book of Acts and with one another, designed to show the truth of the books by a study of their undesigned coincidences. When F.F. Bruce was already in the middle of his scholarly career, he stumbled upon this line of argument, which somehow he had never picked up in all of his professional training. And he writes a very excited paper about it. Like, this is great evidence. Why aren't we talking more about this evidence? If so complete a scholar as F.F. Bruce could have completed his academic training without ever having heard about this, you can understand why most of you may not have heard about this yet. Fabulously valuable material. Finally, the book that's out there on a table and available if you'd like to purchase it, my wife's book, Hidden in Plain View, published exactly a year ago, 2017. She revisited the argument from undesigned coincidences both among the Gospels and between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul. She went through all of John James Blunt's examples, all of Paley's examples. She checked for any cases where you could quibble about it because of textual variance. She discarded ones where people could quibble for those reasons. In some cases, she's enriched the argument. Baker Bookhouse in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is holding a Sweet 16 competition where you can vote So this is the March Madness. You can vote for things in these brackets. This book is in the third round already. So if y'all want to get on their website and vote, that's not a bad idea. But get the book first and start looking through it. Once you do, I think you'll understand why. Nancy, is it a good book? It's a wonderful book, says Nancy. Okay, now you all believe me. See, that's called the argument from authority. All right, I'm going to cut it here and let you ask any questions you like, and we will still, we hope, get out of here in time for lunch. So Travis is walking up the middle aisle with a microphone in hand.
Yes, sir. I was wondering, could you give maybe an example right here of what Dr. Ehrman would point to as a discrepancy, historical error in the Book of Acts, and how would you respond?
Yeah. I have a whole talk just on that, where I go through all of the arguments that he makes, and I just go through them one by one. And you can find a version of that online that I did by, I think it was a Google Hangout. The video quality is not that great, but you can find that there. One of them that everybody wants to go to is that the timeline in Acts 9 doesn't at first glance look like the timeline in Galatians 1 where Paul is telling about it in his own words. Did he go to Jerusalem? When did he go to Jerusalem? How much time was there? You know, he stayed in some place many days, but could that really mean 3 years? So that timeline puzzle trying to line up the account that Luke gives in Acts of the conversion of Paul and the account Paul gives in Galatians 1 is the favorite go-to example, and I cover that extensively in that other talk, so as well as all of the other arguments that Bart lays out. So if you want to see me go after him, that's the real go after Bart talk on the Book of Acts.
What's the name of the talk?
I believe if you just look up the evidential value of Acts, there's only one or two times that I've given a talk on that topic, and one of them is super long and goes through that. I think it might have been the one I did for Jonathan McClatchy's Apologetics Academy. So maybe if you search for Apologetics Academy there. But it was a long presentation. Even I was getting tired of hearing myself speak by the time I was done with it. But I had so much fun I didn't care.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just have more of like a methodological question.
Sure.
So when you take on a big project like this, obviously this is pretty extensive. Where do you begin? I'm just curious in my own life, like when I'm looking at different things and there's such big topics and there's so much there,
Right.
It's
So
difficult to find where to start.
Right, huge topics where to start. And that's one of the reasons why I've given you a couple of actual places to go and begin. I've given you some books, and I would say start there. When I started looking into these things, I didn't know which books had the kind of information I needed, so I had to do a lot of stumbling around. Make reading a priority. Put other stuff aside. You need to be reading so that you can be informed if you're going to do this. I've been reading really intensively on this subject now for a little over a decade. I have a library on my hard drive of public domain books. The PDF files run to about 100 gigs. It's a lot of PDFs, because they're usually, 15, 20 megs a piece. So I have a whole bunch, thousands of these books. You just make a lifestyle choice. It's like, you're going to work out, you're going to go to the gym. You don't say, well, I'll try that out, one day, and then 5 months later, if I feel like it, I'll go again. No, it's like, okay, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, this is, abs and lats, and then you make the lifestyle choice, you just go, you do it. Make your reading like that. Cut out whatever other fluff you have to cut out, and start with the books that I've recommended here, and if you want more, write to me. Tell me what you're trying to find information on. I will be your research assistant. I will tell you places I have found valuable material. Read those things, read their footnotes, chase down the things they're referring to. In Korea, there used to be pencils they'd give to school kids that said, honor your parents, and then you'd rotate it a little bit and it would say, work hard in school. You rotate it a little bit more and it says, read at night. I got the read at night thing down pretty well. I recommend it to you.
Okay, I have another methodological question.
Gotta lean right into the mic.
For those of us who are already on board,
Yeah.
at least in principle, with the read at night thing, how do you convince other people that it matters, more than just telling them it matters?
How do you convince people that they need to educate themselves? Sometimes it takes a tragedy. I had a meal with a pastor up in Michigan, very nice guy. I think he even paid for the meal, where I was trying to get him to take some books on a hard drive, some apologetics works. He heard me out. And then he explained to me very kindly that he was sure that there were denominations in which young people had questions. But in his denomination, the young people didn't have questions. Faced with such dumb innocence, what can you do? I let him go. And I didn't hear from him again until 18 months later, when one night I got a desperate email note from him saying that his son had walked away from Christianity. I couldn't persuade him. He had to be persuaded the way Paul had to be persuaded, the way Jonah had to be persuaded. That may be what it takes. But when I speak in churches and I say, how many of you know someone who went off to college, even a Christian college, and came back without their faith? Hands go up. I spoke at one church. I just mentioned that briefly, and later the pastor came back to me. He said, our secretary came to me crying, and she said, that's what happened to my son. And that's what it's going to take in many of these cases. Nothing less than that will shake them out of their complacency and make them see that loving God with your mind is not an option.
Hey, thanks, Dr. McGrew. This is great. I just kind of have a question about overall. It seems that you made a really good case for the historical reliability of Acts, which is great. Oh gosh, my question has left me. What was I thinking of? That was a good question back there. So you made a good case for the historical reliability of Acts, but my question is...
What about the rest of Scripture?
No. Oh, I'm sorry.
Was that it?
Do what?
Were you wondering about the rest of Scripture? Like, okay, well, that's Acts, but what about the other stuff?
No, actually, just in general, I totally forgot my question. But yeah, how about the rest of the scriptures?
Sure. So the fascinating thing is that in proportion as you would expect us to have evidence for things that are, say, further removed, we also have undesigned coincidences in the Pentateuch. I'll give you one. And then we're going to wrap it, right? When David's son Absalom rebels against him, and David's got to flee, a priest who has been David's right-hand man, named Ahithophel, goes with the rebellion instead of staying with David. And there's no clue given when it tells you that he went to Absalom's side, no clue given as to why he did that. It was said of Ahithophel that his sayings were like the oracles of God himself. How come that happened? Well, if you read around in 2 Samuel and you connect enough dots and you're alert enough, or if you just get a book on undesigned coincidences where somebody's done it for you, you find out that Ahithophel had a son who was in David's guard, and his son had a daughter, and that daughter married another member of David's guard named Uriah. Her name was Bathsheba, and David dishonored Ahithophel's granddaughter. No surprise now, but that's a connection you've got to make by going to three widely separated passages. It's not on the surface of the narrative. You have to connect the dots to see it. And there are things like that crisscrossing the Old Testament, the prophetic narratives, the historical narratives in all directions again. So there's a place to begin if you want to see how this kind of argument could be spread out over a wider surface area.
All right, let's thank Tim.